Hello, my name is Philip Skitch, and I'm the host of the Dad, Nobody Wants to Listen to You About New York podcast. Thank you for listening, and by doing so, I hope we can prove my son wrong. Episode 1, Tipflation. When was the last time you purchased anything and you were not asked for a tip? Not only are requests to tip on purchased goods and services growing, but the amount of the traditional tip has also been on the rise for decades. During the 1950s, people commonly tipped 10% of the bill, and this was common also in the European Union. By the 1970s and the 1980s, that percentage had jumped to 15%. In 2023, people typically tip anywhere from 15% to 25% in New York. Consumers on average said they tipped more than 21%, according to a survey that was done in May 2022. I think what we're seeing now nationwide, and particularly in New York, is something that has even been given a name, Tipflation. At every opportunity, we're being presented with a tablet or a scowly face that's asking us how much we'd like to tip. Meanwhile, if people are willing to give the person delivering food to their home a 30% tip for that service, somebody thought, why not ask if they'd like to tip when they come to the restaurant to pick it up? Restaurants have started doing that more often, and that practice certainly hasn't stopped. Another reason people are tipping more is because of new and cool-looking technologies, kiosks, iPad tablets, with 3 large tipping suggestions that pop up on the screen in front of you. Business owners typically have managed to pick these options, and they can disable and enable features as they want to get as much tip as they think they can. People feel pressured. Quite often they have people standing around them, and they usually give more than they would in a normal situation. People see these options and they think it's an indication of the normative range and feel compelled to tip within that range. So really, it's the more you ask, the more you get. There are 3 prominent companies now in the market that have put these tablets out there. They're very trendy and very sleek. These companies are Square, Toast, and Clover. And although these companies only launched about a decade ago to try to help businesses run smarter and faster, they've become prevalent in the industry. That's because they charge fewer fees than credit card companies. They're less of a burden to accept multiple credit cards. They don't require long-term contracts. And they usually offer multiple other very useful tools, including inventory management and employee management. They've taken the credit card processing out of the hands of individuals and small merchants, and it's been a tremendous growth story. It's nearly half of the business today. But with customers tipping more, where is the proverbial tipping point? I believe that tips are going up from where they are today. The evidence proves that. But I also think there has to be some form of logical ceiling somewhere. I'm not sure I know where this is. So in this episode, I want to look at the history of tipping in America. I want to make some personal observations of the state of play, including the psychological and technical methods used to get tips. I want to look into why tipping has become a big problem not only for customers, but also for the managers of the service sites and even the employees. I want to share with you my research on America's big falling out with tipping, as well as look at alternative models to tipping. But one thing that is definitely for sure in New York is that tipping is growing, and it's as strong as it's ever been. Just to give you a quick feeling of how things are, I went with my family to the Pizza Village in Montauk in New York, and I just had the most simple meal you can imagine, consisting of a couple of sodas, 2 Bud Light at $15.90 for 2 little bottles of Bud Light. But that's just a completely different story because prices have gone crazy. We had French fries, grilled chicken, a seasoned salad, and some chicken wings. And my daughter, she had a small margarita pizza. That came to the grand total of $85.96. Now, you've got to picture this. This wasn't a fancy restaurant. This was like a side-of-the-road cafe. And I got this bill, and it had suggested tip at the bottom of the bill, 18%, 20%, or 22%. And very, very conveniently for me, it told me what the amount would be and the total. So, of course, you look at that, particularly as a tourist, perhaps, you don't think anything more than looking at that as a suggestion. And I paid. I gave the lady 20 bucks. I thought, well, why not? She was very nice. And it was only when I got back to Germany that I looked at this bill, and I saw that there was a service charge already. It says service charge 4%, $3. I have absolutely no idea what that is. I can only imagine that this is just part of the problem, is that they have a service charge which maybe covers something which the customer doesn't know, and then the tip is put on top. Maybe the waitress gets the tip only and not the service charge, but I don't know. And we arrived at our apartment in Bushwick, and my son was there, and he had arranged for some food for us, and we decided also to have a Chinese takeaway. Since there was a Chinese takeaway on the corner, and I had really no idea what the prices would be or anything else, but my son, being a long-time resident of Brooklyn, had no problems. He just called the people, he ordered the food, and he asked what the total would be. He'd already worked out from the takeaway menu that we had what the price should be. I was too jet-lagged to really register anything was wrong, but not my son, who's very smart. Maybe like most New York residents now, and he immediately queried the total, which was over $100 for 4 people, which I suppose wasn't that much, but it shouldn't have been that. It should have been 80 something. And he asked the person on the other end of the phone to please go through what he's charging, and in the process, all the food added up to 80. So he said, "Well, what's the difference?" And the guy said, "Oh, it's my service charge." And my son said, "What do you mean a service charge? We're coming to pick it up." And there was a sort of a silence, and then he said, "Well, that's how I make my money." And my son said, "Well, I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. Do you want me to talk to your manager, or will you take it off?" So the guy agreed to take it off. But what a scandal. And even that was a surprise for my son. That was another way that people were thinking they can get tips from people. You go to a Chinese takeaway, you pick it up, and they're now charging you a service charge. How ridiculous is that? Well, tipping in the United States has a history. It's worth looking at it. Mainly, the problem is that nobody really understands exactly where that history comes from. They believe that it came from Europe. American tourists probably going over to Europe, seeing that things were tipping over there, and decided to bring that back to the United States. There's even the strange belief that the word tip is short for to ensure promptness. And that used to be written on dishes in shops in the United Kingdom. Whether that's true, I don't know. But one of the big reasons I'm very interested in this subject is why wealthy Americans brought tipping back in the 1850s and the 1860s as a tradition, and why it's taken off so well. Some would say it's because they came back wanting to feel aristocratic or important, or they felt superior. There's even a school of thought that believes that it's got something directly to do with the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. It could also be that after the Civil War and during the times of slavery and its slow decline, people would tip the ex-slaves who were doing work because they weren't actually getting any salary. They were quite often expected to do sharecropping or other menial jobs, usually servants, waiters, or barbers, or railway porters, and they weren't paid. So people would offer a small tip instead. This basically became the way to pay salaries. And that idea is something that persists to this day. But I think eventually it got out of control. And then I think in about 1918, it was actually banned in various states of the United States. And in fact, people who accepted gratuities could be fined. Not the people who gave the money, but the people who received them. They could even be imprisoned. So there was a lot of pushback, particularly in the southern states of America. But I don't think a lot of people paid much attention to it, and it persisted to this day. So in about 1938, legislation was passed, and it required employers to pay tipped workers a wage, and that would add up to a federal minimum wage when combined with the tips. That still exists today as well. Right now, in the United States, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. And in New York, the minimum wage is now $14.20 per hour. I wonder how we've got from there to today. I was just reading a very simple story about a young lady called Madison Tate, and she's a New York City waitress. And she got a lot of prominence and I think a lot of TikTok views for slamming Europeans for only leaving what she considered to be a tiny tip of 10%. And she was quoted as saying, "I hate Europeans." She thinks that tipping is a cultural thing and Europeans are different, and why? Well, I'm a European and an American, and I can see that from her point of view, where people are getting 25%, that may seem strange. But in Germany, it's very normal if you have a bill of, say, 95 euros, to round it up to something like 100 euros. Not always is 10% given. I think most definitely in England, people are a little more sensitive to the cultural norm, and they will give 10 or 15% in top establishments. But I think for Madison to believe that Europeans are stingy for only leaving 10% is completely wrong. A recent survey in the United States, a Bankrate poll, showed that only 35% of Gen Zers, 18 to 26-year-olds, say they will always tip at a sit-down restaurant. And I think the feeling is, amongst a lot of younger people, that they're struggling, particularly if they're paying huge rents or university fees, and they really cannot afford to be tipping waitresses 25%. I read another report, and I think it was a student, and she was saying that she was asked when she was shopping online to tip as well. She felt she was being made to feel guilty for not tipping online. This whole tipping situation has now been called Tipflation. There was a story of a self-serve checkout machine at Newark Airport only a few weeks ago, and it prompts you to tip either 15%, 18%, or 20%. Some machines even go as high as 30%. But you wonder, who exactly are you tipping? Because you've served yourself. Some commentators have gone as far as saying it's a shakedown of optional tips. It's no wonder that Americans seem to be getting tired of tipping. The Bankrate survey that I mentioned earlier, I revealed that 66% of people who were surveyed are negative about tipping, and 41% feel that businesses should be paying their staff better so that the tips don't have to be there in the first place. And 32% in that survey said that tipping has got completely out of control. There is the increasing suggestion that many patrons would be willing to pay slightly higher prices if tipping was abolished from restaurants. Like most people, when I arrived in New York, I picked a taxi, and it took me to my flat in Bushwick, and I saw the price, 57 euros or something it was, and I tipped the guy probably quite a lot of money. I just feel that's normal because that's what I do in Europe. On the way out, at my son's advice, I used Uber. Had never used Uber before, believe it or not, because it's not as widely used in Europe as it is in the United States of America. And right at the end of the journey, it asked me if I would like to tip. I didn't have to offer a tip to the driver, which was quite nice, I thought. And I went into the airport and I went back to my app. But by then, I think too much time had passed and it didn't allow me to offer any form of tip at all. While I was in New York, I had the opportunity to talk to some delivery drivers, and I spoke to one, and he said that he only delivers food in wealthy areas to ensure good tips. And I read an article in the newspaper that said that even Apple Store employees are wanting to start asking for tips. I think they're feeling that they're unionized and they're entitled to this. During the 2 different periods that I was actually working in New York, I obviously was pretty familiar with the unions. We did a lot of work with them because most hotels in New York are unionized now. And the New York, New Jersey Hotel and Gaming Workers Union, or Local 6, has tremendous power and can influence the contracts in the hotels, and in terms of the tips can set the rates that they feel that should be applicable, or how the hotels should compensate their staff if there are not enough tips. All the workers who are a member of the union are covered by this industry-wide agreement and are given other benefits such as health insurance, life insurance, pensions, workers' compensation, and as I discovered mainly, representation in times of dispute, etc. But all of this was not funded by the union, although they gave the impression to the members of the union that it was, through their dues. It was actually funded by the hotels as a separate payment. But it was very misunderstood. As I mentioned earlier, the minimum wage in New York is now $14.20 per hour. And that is an astonishing amount of money. In one of the hotels where a friend of mine is the manager, he told me that a chambermaid or a room attendant gets paid $37 an hour in Manhattan. And in another hotel which I went to visit, hall porters were being paid over $40 an hour. But these apparently large hourly salaries are not the full picture, because hoteliers and restaurants can actually get away with only paying $10 an hour as long as they have a guaranteed tip allowance of $5 per hour that's added to the total. So the waiters are guaranteed to get at least the minimum salary payable by New York law. Waiters are therefore assured that they're always going to get the minimum wage, and the employers are quite happy because they end up only having to pay $10 per hour, with the rest coming from the customer. So in fact, the customer is subsidizing the waiters' salaries. You could argue, therefore, that this rumor that's gone over the years that, waiting staff are not paid enough, that's why you have to give them a tip, it's partly true. They're deliberately not paid enough because the owners can get away with it by law. So although some waiters will get to keep their tips directly, that is, if they serve a table, they get to keep the tip that's posted. Many establishments maintain these pool tips, which means everyone working on a shift at any one time has to put all their tips into a pool. That would include cash tips as well as tips received on credit cards. Now, this is also fraught with problems because some waiters don't get as much as others, and there is no legal description or criteria that sets what percentage of redistribution has to be. So you'll find that, as I found in my first example, restaurants, hotels will add a service charge automatically because that then assures the restaurant or the bar or the hotel that they're going to get an amount of money that they can use to offset the salary, even if there are no tips given on top. So you can see quite clearly, in most cases, the establishments have covered the salaries, the minimum salaries for the waiters, and that tips are really just something on top. I took the opportunity to talk to a few people working in bars in Manhattan, And they told me that on a busy night, they could make between $400 and $1,000 tips. That wasn't every night, of course. There were very slow nights as well, maybe weekends or when it was raining or a holiday period, where they would only make between 100 and 200 tips during the course of a day. So it does vary according to various factors. But on average, she thought it was about 200 in tips a night for sure. So with a base salary, staff can usually make between $30 and $50 an hour. So, but can you really see a hotel owner or a bar owner or a restaurant owner wanting to start paying the staff up to $50 per hour? Already they're upset that they're having to pay $37 to $40 an hour for people who are non-tipped. So many experienced waiters right at the very top of the game, perhaps at places like the River Cafe, can make as much as $200,000 a year with tips. And some other venues, they can even make as high as $300,000 a year. That may sound extreme, and it probably is very much at the top of the market. But in conclusion, tips are, in this case, an incentive for very good service. But there really is zero incentive for owners to do anything, as they can already save 1/3 of the hourly salary just by topping it up with a service charge or a tip. So there is also zero initiative for people to not want to take tips if you're a waiter, because they just keep taking and adding to their salary. And who is paying? But the customer. But this model has really got out of control because more and more people are getting more worried about the money they're having to pay to eat out. And the number of people eating out is falling. And it's going to continue to fall because when you're paying more in tips than you are probably for your main course, something has got way out of whack. The argument has always been made in restaurants that if you tip someone, you get improved service. That's now being shown to be wrong because new models are coming out for a number of years now where tips are not allowed. There is a so-called no tipping concept that was introduced before the pandemic, and it was beginning to get traction amongst the restaurant community, not just in New York, but throughout the United States. But COVID-19 really hampered this because at least, I believe, 600 restaurants closed. It was devastating to the industry, and even now, restaurants haven't picked up. The staffing availability has gone down as well, with many people who used to work in restaurants moving into other businesses that offered work. And a lot of people who were foreigners went back to their home countries. This is not a unique situation to New York. This has happened in Germany, it's happened in England, and I'm sure it's happened all over the world. The concept of no tipping is a very good concept because it stops the frustration that exists between front of house staff and back of house staff. Almost since tipping began, there was a dispute between people who work in front of the customer and can get tips and all the back office staff who just don't get a chance to get tips. And this caused tremendous resentment. The other problem with tipping, historically, tips came from people who were in some way poor or needed extra support. And that's not really the case anymore. And tipping someone can be seen as a superior act, and receiving a tip can be seen as somehow demeaning. So momentum built in the last 5 years in New York City to go to a no tipping policy. But really, since the return to business after COVID, there's been such fierce fight and competition for staff that most restaurants started to give up on that idea because they just couldn't afford to lose their good staff and therefore often their good customers because they weren't offering as much money as another restaurant. So most of the bars and restaurants and hotels that introduced a no-tip policy have started to reintroduce tips again. Not allowing tips had to be subsidized somehow, and usually that was through the prices on the menu. And of course, with prices going up enormously in Manhattan, over 100% in the last year alone, It's very difficult for the patrons to be able to justify paying so much more money than another restaurant on the face of seeing a menu price. When a restaurant customer comes into a restaurant, it's not very easy to justify that difference in price because it includes an element of tip. People are much less likely to spend an extra dollar on a menu item than they are perhaps to throw an extra dollar at a tip. There have been suggestions that the New York City government could offer some form of tip-free tax breaks to proprietors. The law could be changed that could stop restaurants being able to offload the labor costs onto customers by allowing restaurants to reduce the minimum wage by 1/3 if tips are added. It may be a way forward for restaurants to equalize pay for front and back office staff as long as they're all paid a minimum wage. And this so-called unlocked pooling, or allowing all the pooled tips to be distributed to different job categories, is a great idea, but it's still illegal in New York, even after there was a national statutory change. The proponents of no tipping also point out that when tips are allowed, there is an element of fear amongst particularly female staff because there is an element of sexual harassment that can come into the tipping. It's well known that men, particularly who attend a restaurant or a bar, might well harass the waitresses and do so by giving big tips. There have been a number of studies done at Harvard about the psychology of tips, and it's been demonstrated that psychologically a lot of people like tipping as it gives them this sense of power and superiority. So in the end, what remains is this very old-fashioned notion of tipping, and it could be considered that it's wrong that businesses don't pay staff living wages in full. But unions keep fighting for higher basics and benefits, and it becomes more and more expensive for employers, and so employers have no incentive to start paying more salaries. For the employees, the cost of living in New York has gone through the roof. They need to be earning more money in order to pay the rents. It's quite obvious that most of the people who work as waiters cannot fund an apartment in New York, even if they're sharing with 3 or 4 people. They have to live quite far out and travel. For customers, we now have a real mess in New York, where tipping has reached stupid proportions of greed that spoil the fun and price out many from even eating out. I was in a Chinese restaurant towards the end of my stay, and not only did you have to give a tip of 20% in the Chinese restaurant, people were looking you in the eye when you left, and there was a tip jar right by the grill station, and these people were expecting a tip. There was also a tip jar in the toilets. So the technology, the psychology, and the history of tipping has now come together, and it's become almost a perfect art of trying to get as much money out of the customer as possible. But this is not right, and it needs to stop. Thanks very much for listening to episode 1 of Dad, Nobody Wants to Listen to You About New York. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the New York subway system.